So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning about the shutter speed. Okay, so we've looked at the aperture, and the shutter speed is another part of the triangle. And then we're going to look at the ISO. And the combination of the three creates a balanced exposure. So the shutter speed is all to do with time. It's to do with how long you set your shutter and how long you leave it open for. So if you have a slow shutter speed, and here we've got quite a slow one, you can hear that's a 1 second. So that's quite a slow shutter speed. The picture will be completely blurry. You need to make sure you put your camera on a tripod when you're shooting at anything below 30th of a second. Remember, we're looking at fractions of seconds. So to the opposite end of the spectrum, we can go all the way up to 4,000th of a second. And if we listen to this, I'll look through there, much faster. Okay, so that will freeze the movement. So sports photographers, they'll be using fast shutter speeds to capture that action. But maybe landscape photographers that want to show the blurred motion of water will then start to use a much longer shutter speed. So you need to decide, what shutter speed is appropriate to the type of images that you are taking. Remember that if you change the shutter speed, that's going to affect your aperture as well. So you need to balance the time and the amount of light to get the perfect exposure. Okay, thank you. So how does the shutter work? So the shutter itself is like a light tight curtain that sits in front of the sensor of the camera. So during the exposure, the shutter is opened when you press the shutter release button, and then depending what speed you set that at, then it closes. So the length of the time the shutter is opened is called the shutter speed. So the shutter controls how long the shutter is open to let the light in. So the shutter is just here, and it just sits behind the mirror. So once that's pressed here on the shutter release, then the mirror's released, flicks up, and then the light travels through the shutter and then will hit the sensor of the camera. So when you're looking at exposures and the shutter speed, we need to remember these are fractions of seconds. So the more exposure time you have, the longer the exposure time, the brighter the image will be. And if it's too long, then it's overexposed. So then you need to make the shutter speed shorter to compensate, to get it to good exposure. And if the shutter speed is too short, then the image will appear too dark, and that's called underexposed. Now, as I've said, some people they will use the underexposing technique to create really beautiful landscapes and want to get details in the sunsets, and equally with the overexposed, you may want to take some really beautiful bleached fashion or portrait photos. So these are two techniques that you can apply deliberately to, create those images that you want. So how do you change your shutter speed on your camera? So we use the same dial. This is a dial that you use for your aperture, but to change your shutter speed, you don't need to press this as well. You just press this dial. You can see here my camera's set on manual, but if you want it to be shutter priority, then you can press S here. And on Canon cameras and other cameras, it might say TV, and that's shutter priority. But for now, I want to encourage you to always set your camera onto the manual setting. So you turn your dial up and down to change the shutter speed. So the definition. So the shutter speed means how long the shutter is left open. A fast shutter speed freezes movement, and a slow shutter speed shows movement. So here in this image I've taken, this is a fast shutter speed. So you can see that it's shown the detail and the sharp movement of the water here around my daughter's face here. And it's captured the movement of the light as well. In contrast, I have this other image of my daughter where this is called slow shutter speed. It shows the blurred motion of her. So the camera is placed on a tripod and you can see this view of this beach is nice and sharp in contrast with her moving as she's dancing in front of the camera. So the shutter speed here, this is fractions of the second. So this is 2,500th of a second. So this is a really fast shutter speed. And you can see here it shows the droplets of water as it's coming out of the hose, as I'm watering my plant. And here the aperture is at 1.8. This is because this is a really short, fast shutter speed. Therefore, you need to have a wide, open aperture to compensate. And here, we're starting to get a slightly slower shutter speed. It's still relatively fast, 640th of a second. But now the aperture, we're starting to close it down to 3.5. Okay, we can still see some of the droplets, but we are beginning to see the motion of the water, the direction that the water is coming. Whilst in the previous image, they look very much like frozen droplets here. Whilst here, it's being sort of a sprayed effect. And now we're at 400th of a second, so you're seeing a bit more of a sort of blurred motion of the water. It's focusing on some points here, and the aperture has closed down even more, so it's now at 4.5. And here we go. So this is at 160 of a second. So you just see more of the direction of the water. You're not seeing the droplets of the water as clearly, unless they're on the foxglove here, on this plant here. But generally, it's beginning to look quite blurred, and beginning to look a little bit lighter as well. And this is the aperture is at 5.6, so that's sort of mid-range depth of field. Now, the shutter speed here is at a 30th, so it's getting even lighter, and the aperture is now at f13, so we've closed it down even more. Now, this is a really important point to remember. Always remember to use a tripod or a flat surface, a level surface, if you are shooting at 30th of a second or any speed below a 30th to avoid camera shake. So for this image, I've put the camera on a tripod and I've set the self timer. And here now we're at 1/4 of a second and you can barely see the water. It's become really light, but I am hosing the foxglove. You can see it blurred motion as well here because it's a long exposure, so it's capturing that movement. But because the camera's on a tripod, you can see the fence is nice and sharp and maintains all the detail. And that there is f16. So that's the largest depth of field there, so it's pulling all the focus in. But you can barely see the water there because it's so fast. So that is how the shutter speed works. And always remember, make sure you keep your camera on a tripod if you're shooting at 30th of a second or anything below, because then the camera records what your naked eye can't see. So all those wonderful lights, trails of lights in shutter speed images, you can take those, drawing with lights, drawing with torches. As long as the camera's on the tripod, it will continue to record the light that it sees. Okay, so thank you.